of Automobile Manufacturers, or NAMSA, now the Automotive Business Council, has raised the alarm over escalating U.S. tariffs, warning that the 25% levy on vehicle exports, which took effect in April and is set to climb to 30% in August, could push South Africa's auto industry into a full-blown socioeconomic crisis. The Eastern Cape's key automotive hubs, including East London, risk becoming ghost towns as production slows and jobs are threatened. Adding to the uncertainty, the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, remains unclear. For more on the potential impact, we're joined now by NAMSA Chief Economist, Dr. Paulina Mamogobo. Dr. Mamogobo, thank you for joining us. How are you this morning?
I'm well, thanks. And how are you, Asanda? And good morning to your listeners.
We're good. Thank you so much. And thanks for making time. What are the immediate risks facing automotive hubs like East London under this new tariff regime of the U.S.?
Thank you for the question, Asanda. So the interesting thing, just to paint a picture for the listeners as well, is the nature of the automotive industry in South Africa. Number one, it's important to acknowledge that it is a significantly export-led industry, meaning that of what we produce, 65% of that is actually channeled for the export market. So you can imagine when we talk about the immediate impact, the conversation then becomes that with these tariffs, especially in the US market, it means that when we are hit with such tariffs already, that means losing the potential access or competitiveness in that particular market. Now, you're asking the questions around especially these economic hubs. So the nature of the automotive industry in South Africa is that it is clustered in particular regions. So I'll give an example. In Gauteng, we would have 3 OEMs, Ford, Nissan, and BMW. In the Eastern Cape, we have VW, Isuzu, and we've got Mercedes-Benz, and then we've got the likes of Toyota and KZN. What this then does is that the clustered nature of this, we need to understand that these continue to anchor economic activities in those particular regions or those particular towns. So if we lose a market access in the US, for example, owing to these tariffs, this automatically will impact in terms of production because our production is always linked to export. Like I said, we're an export-led industry. Now, there are ripple effects because it does not just hit production in terms of the OEMs, but it also impacts the value chain. That is suppliers that continue to supply to these OEMs. And of course, other economic activities that are trickled by the existence of these OEMs in those markets. So our concern is that loss of market access, then we will see the ripple effect domestically, and likely, like we said, and also in our press release, that we don't want to see these economic hubs in South Africa becoming ghost towns because we have seen our OEMs actually anchoring those industries or those towns for the longest of time.
South Africa's automotive industry is the third largest contributor to the economy of the country after mining and financial services, and traditionally the leader in Africa. So is there reason to panic at this point? I know you mentioned that we are export reliant, but does it not mean that this is a strong enough industry to survive even with these tariffs?
So we have seen the resilience of our industry, and like you mentioned, we are the third largest contributor in terms of GDP. So the beauty of it is that we've got other markets that we continue to export to. So I'll give an example. In 2023, we were exporting to 148 markets, and we've been able to increase that in 2024 to an additional 155 markets. So meaning that we do have a broader footprint in terms of our export market. For example, whilst we are looking in the terms of the tariffs, the conversation around the US, our biggest export market is actually Europe. What we have seen then in terms of our figures, especially the first quarter of the year, is that while we were losing actually market share in the US, for example, our exports declined by 73%, but we have seen our export competitiveness being upheld by markets like Europe, where we continue to send over 250,000 vehicles per annum. So one of the things that we've seen as well is we've seen the African region also being another market that continues to take up vehicles that are actually manufactured in the South African base. So to answer your question directly is that not necessarily a reason to panic at the moment. Of course, we need to acknowledge that market diversification or finding new markets is not an overnight exercise. But what this then means is to say, how do we ensure that we continue to advocate at least for market access and competitiveness in those markets? Because the other interesting thing, Asanda, if I can mention, is that there continues to be increasing competition in the markets that we're already exporting to. So I'll give this example that when we are hit by tariffs by the US, we are not the only market that has been hit by those tariffs. So if we are pivoting to Europe, we must understand that other markets like Thailand, maybe Vietnam, that are also impacted by the tariffs, they will also say, where else do we pivot our production? So there's intensifying competition, and I think that's what continues to put pressure as well in terms of us domestically. But it is the broadness of our export market reach that also gives us comfort that we will continue to be resilient as well.
You mentioned ripple effects as far as it comes to components. So how much of an impact really will they be feeling, component manufacturers and logistics providers, as a result of those ripple effects?
Because these component manufacturers and logistics, they actually supply or contribute or are linked to the change in terms of our OEM production. Any impact in terms of production, be the reduction of volumes, etc., also impacts what orders they are able to continue getting from the OEMs, as an example. So the ripple effect includes that. Also, the moving of outbound logistics. If we are being hit by tariffs, it means that our exports are impacted. So logistics, as an example, as well, would be impacted because that speaks to the movement of goods as well, outbound and inbound. So those are the conversations that we continue to look at. And like I said, it actually, the catalytic nature of our industry goes even beyond just components and logistics as well, but it looks at all the other suppliers, be it suppliers that are doing the caterings, etc. That becomes part of the bigger conversation. But what we have seen as well is we've seen our OEMs being quite resilient and committed to the industrialization of this country. And we've seen that because they've continued to make growing investments as well. And they want to make sure that they are committed and they continue to anchor as well the competitiveness of this industry domestically. So yes, there will be that impact overall that is likely to shake us a bit, but it's important to also mention that we have seen and weathered harder storms before, and though we don't know how long this one would last, but we are quite confident and optimistic that we'll be able to weather it again. Thank you.
As we talk about the growth of investments, can South Africa, the way you see it and as the way things stand, succeed in export diversification into other markets, and how long would that take?
Definitely we can succeed. And I think I mentioned the importance that export diversification is not something that just happens overnight. But maybe when we look at how we have been competitive in terms of the automotive industry, AGOA has been a bilateral trade regime. We've got the EU Extended Partnership Agreement. We've got the AFCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a potential market. And I think it's also in terms of how we are campaigning for market expansion in terms of those trade regimes that will enable us also to remain quite competitive. So one of the things that we continue to advocate for as NAMSA as well is that policy certainty, as an example, around new energy vehicles, because we realize that markets like Europe, that I said is our leading export market, continues to pivot into those markets. So that policy certainty that will enable our manufacturers to be able to produce and meet demand in those markets is what will enable us as well to secure existing markets. In terms of other additional markets, I mean, South Africa is a member of other economic blocs. Of course, what has made us competitive is preferential trade agreements. So with the likes of BRICS and other markets, we don't necessarily have, we have economic cooperation frameworks, not necessarily trade agreements. But what our government in conversation with them continues to do as well is to say, how do they explore conversations around economic agreements as well, or frameworks that can actually create that competitiveness or open market access as well into those markets so that we remain quite competitive. Because in the absence of enabling frameworks, of course, then the economics thereof become quite an uphill.
Dr. Mamogobo, we appreciate your time again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Paulina Mamogobo is Chief Economist for the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers in South Africa, or NAMSA, now the Automotive Business Council.
Wake up